Hi, welcome to this week's edition of PHQ, questions from the personality hacker community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And Addison, let's get right to our question today.
Hi, Joel and Antonia. I love your podcast. Your combination of depth and eloquence make each episode interesting and enjoyable. I was wondering if you can explore how and why we may develop certain cognitive functions to the same degree as our innate preferences, and also what to do with that information going forward. For instance, while my preference for introverted intuition as a means of taking in information is clear, I seem to use TI, FI, and FE virtually equally for evaluating information, which is probably why decision-making exhausts me. Many thanks for sharing your gifts. Jill.
Thanks, Jill, for the question.
Yeah, and it's a good one because it goes back to a question we get a lot. And we may have actually had maybe we had a PHQ in the past that addressed what are called the four shadow functions. So in the cognitive function stack for each personality type, there are four cognitive functions that make up what's technically called your stack. And that's what we always refer to, using the car model as a metaphor. Your driver, your co-pilot, your 10-year-old and 3-year-old. And they're technically called your dominant, your auxiliary, your tertiary, and your inferior. And then there are four other cognitive functions, because there's 8 in total, that aren't in your stack. There are some models that talk about some trending and predictable quality to how each personality type engages with those other four shadow processes, like John Beebe's 8-function model. But what I've noticed is that those last four functions, the ones that, like Beebe's model about how they show up for you, my observation has been that those aren't as predictable. And I was recently talking to Dario Nardi about Beebe's model, and I mentioned that I find that those last four functions actually tend to show up, as opposed to the predictable model, they tend to show up more unpredictably based on influencers in your life, like what are the personality types of your parents or the people who are highly influential in your life, and which cognitive functions did they encourage you to use. And that seems to be more of a not predictable, that seems to be an entirely random and rather arbitrary use of those last four functions.
Yeah, like for myself example, I was raised by a dad who's an ISFP, my brother's an ESFP. There's a lot of SE, a lot of sensation in my household. So I have a lot of sensation development, even though it's not part of my personality. It shows up for me because I was around it so much growing up.
Right. And whereas I grew up in a family that was primarily dominated by the introverted thinking, extroverted feeling polarity or accuracy harmony, and the only person who used effectiveness in my family or extroverted thinking was my ENTJ brother. And he had introverted feeling or authenticity as his inferior or 3-year-old process. So I very rarely use introverted feeling or authenticity. It seems like sort of a magic function to me. And that's probably one of the reasons why I'm so attracted to people who use that process. So there are models that talk about how you're going to use those four shadow processes, but I find that we are very influenced by the people in our lives and our circumstances and how we were raised in how we're going to use those other processes. Now, the reason why I mentioned that is because you mentioned that you use 3 of the decision-making or judging processes, it feels like, in equal parts. My guess, because you mentioned that you very clearly lead with introverted intuition, or what we call perspectives, is that you're an INFJ. Because you mentioned 3 of those judging processes and none of them were extroverted thinking or effectiveness, which is what an INTJ is going to use. So my guess is that you're an INFJ. And you feel like you're using extroverted feeling, introverted thinking, and introverted feeling in equal parts. Now, in your cognitive function stack, if you are an INFJ, you're leading with introverted intuition, and then you're supplementing it as your co-pilot process or auxiliary with extroverted feeling. And that's the process you should be using to use as your evaluative criteria for making decisions. And then the 10-year-old process, what's technically called the tertiary, but the 10-year-old in our car model, that would be introverted thinking. So it makes sense that you would be pulling on both of those functions to help inform the decisions that you're making. And the one sort of wild card is introverted feeling, which is not in an INFJ's 4-function stack. So that's one of the shadow processes, and that's why we mentioned shadow functions. Because you may have been encouraged at some point in your life to develop and utilize introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity. Now, the question is, what should you be using, right? Like, if you're using all 3 of these things in equal parts, which is the one that should be your go-to tool for decision-making or judging? And I would argue, as we always do, that the sweet spot is your secondary process or that co-pilot process of extroverted feeling. And the reason why this is particularly important for an INFJ is that, or actually all of us should be using our co-pilot, but the reason why this is relevant to you as well is that you're leading with a process that is technically called introverted intuition. It is an introverted process. Of the three judging processes or decision-making that you mentioned you call upon, two of them are also introverted thinking and introverted feeling. Only one of them is extroverted, which is extroverted feeling. That extroverted process, the reason why it's your co-pilot or your auxiliary, the reason why it's so recommended that you focus on that and utilize that is because it gives you access to something that none of the other three functions will give you of introverted intuition, introverted feeling, and introverted thinking, right? None of those three are going to give you access to outer world feedback. Outer world feedback is imperative for all of us to be able to keep a line to the outside, quote unquote, real world. Now, leading with introverted intuition means that you're already going to be very familiar with the landscape of your internal world. And that's great. We all need a way to engage with our inner world as well so we don't lose track of ourselves. But in order to be a complete person, you can't just go from an introverted perceiving process to an introverted decision-making process, like introverted feeling and introverted thinking, and feel like you've got a complete picture, right? They're just not going to give you access to that outside world. Whereas extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony, that will give you access to that outside world. It will give you outer world feedback. It will help you become a more balanced person. So yeah, it makes sense that you would, if you were a complete, whole, well-developed INFJ, you'd be using introverted intuition and extroverted feeling, and it makes sense that you would be seasoning that decision-making with other judging processes like we all do. You would be seasoning it with your 10-year-old or tertiary process of introverted thinking, and you might even season it with introverted feeling or what we call authenticity. That's no problem to season your decision-making processes with these other cognitive functions. However, if you're having trouble making decisions, if this is something that is a struggle for you and you're not sure which one you should focus on, our strong recommendation is to focus on that co-pilot process of extroverted feeling because it really does balance you out. And we've written articles on the website about it. Go to personalityhacker.com. There's an entire page that it's called INFJ Resources. In there is an article we wrote about developing that co-pilot process of harmony and what it does for you and strategies for developing it. And I think if you focus on developing that process, you're going to find yourself in a much better position to make higher quality decisions, and you'll find yourself, waffling a little less. You won't find yourself in that situation where you're indecisive or having trouble making decisions.
Yeah, thanks, Jill, for the question. If you're a new listener and you're listening into this episode of PHQ, this is our question and answer format podcast that comes out weekly. We also have a main podcast, the Personality Hacker podcast, that comes out weekly. And that podcast is a little less technical. It's a little less deep dive with a lot of the terminology and stuff that we're using here. It's more approachable for most people when they're just starting out with some of this. So I recommend you join us for one of our main podcasts also. You can find all the information about that podcast, all the articles written, all the products and services and programs we have at personalityhacker.com. We also want to encourage you to come over to facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. If you have your own question for us, you can ask that question in two ways. You can write it in and we can read it and answer it live on the air, or you can record an audio of your question. You can do that over at personalityhacker.com/questions, and we can get to those when we get to them because we got lots of questions pouring in from different people that listen. So thanks again, Jill, for the question. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
This has been the Personality Hacker PHQ questions from the Personality Hacker community. We'll talk to you on the next episode.